Welcome to EFC's webinar on Church and Faith Trends. My name is Rick Heemstra. I'm the Director of Research here at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. A few housekeeping things before we get started. This presentation will last about 45 minutes. If you have questions, you can send them to me in the chat window or at my email address, which is on the screen currently and will appear at the top right-hand corner of most of the slides. I'll do my best to get to them as we go along. We're talking today about church and faith trends. If you've seen me do seminars before, some of these slides will look familiar to you. What won't be as familiar is the amount of time that I'm going to spend talking about movies, TV shows, and technology. We're going to use these as a foil to look at the changes in our ministry context. And so I'm going to start by talking about Jason Bourne. Jason Bourne is a character. He's a creation of Robert Ludlum. There's a series of books and movies about this character. They're set as a post-Cold War spy thriller in which the enemy has become the state. And in this case, the state that is the enemy is the United States, which is Jason's home country. Now, I said that this is a thriller, but it's also a horror movie. And what makes a horror movie horrible is that there are things that you think you should be able to trust that have turned against you. And Jason volunteers for a clandestine CIA program called Treadstone, where his memory is erased and he's turned into an assassin. And this is the important thing here, is that he forgets who he is. And this is where we stop first cultural themes around Jason Bourne. Memory, or the loss of memory, is huge in our culture right now. And with a loss of memory goes a loss of identity. These things go hand in hand, and this sets us up for the great spiritual quest of our culture, which is finding out who you really are, or connecting with an identity that you've forgotten. We used to have received identities in our culture. We would receive elements of things like family, nation, and career. So if your dad was a Canadian farmer, chances are that you would be too. And it's not that there was some national brainwashing program that made us forget our past. Rather, over the decades, we have deconstructed our past. And what that means is we've looked at all of the things in the past, the pieces of our identity, and we've said that there are problems with them. There are problems with your family. There are problems with your nation, with your profession. And so what happens is these things become unusable because they're tainted. And if your past is tainted and these are the building blocks of your identity, then you take a pass on them when it comes time to construct or form an identity. So you don't use them. And this becomes a kind of forgetfulness that provokes a crisis of identity. And that's what a lot of our movie makers right now are exploring in their movies when they have characters that forget their pasts. Now, up on the screen in the top corner, right corner, we also have the word time here. And this becomes an important piece of this identity formation as well, because the Christian worldview has a past, present, future time sequence. This is even baked into our worship. When we say that God is the God who was and is to come, we are setting up a time sequence. Now, you can be cut off from your past because it is tainted and unusable, but you can also be cut off from your future. And you can be cut off from your future because you don't expect to ever attain to it. And what happens, and I'm going to use movies again in our culture here, is that we project a future where there is an apocalyptic catastrophe of some kind. It might be an environmental apocalypse, a nuclear war, or even a zombie apocalypse, or a dystopia. A dystopia is a future, to use another movie like The Hunger Games. And in The Hunger Games, I might add, is a dystopia where their past is cut off as well. So you can be cut off from your past, you can be cut off from your future. And Jason Bourne, to come back to the character that we're talking about, he has no future because he's hunted by everyone. That future will never be there for him. If he pops up on the grid, as they say in the movie, he dies. And so if your past is inaccessible and your future is inaccessible, you live in the present. And this becomes a way of being. And this is largely what is happening, especially among young people in our culture. Next thing I want to look at is authority. So in our society, what has happened is the locus of authority in our lives is moving inside. In the past, the loci of authority would be in things external to ourselves, like the Bible, the church, family, country. Now, what happens is that I decide what is right and wrong, and I'm only morally answerable to myself. Now, this has some huge implications. Now, I want to talk about how do you make that switch? How do you say that I'm going to move the authority inside myself? Well, first of all, the external loci of authority have to fall somehow. They have to fall into disrepute. And in the Bourne movie, you have the external loci of authority represented by the CIA and the government, that they turn bad. And so that's a reason to reject them. And similarly, when we deconstructed our past, we have reasons to reject those other loci of authority. And so the conclusion here is that the only person that Jason can trust is himself. And so he moves authority inside. He's the only trustworthy person. So we have the slow and steady corruption of authority through deconstruction and scholarship, but there's also, in our own lives, there's been enough real life abuses of authority. So if I'm the locus of authority and I'm deciding what's right and wrong, that has implications. I don't know whether you've seen any of the Jason Bourne movies, but the guy's a killing machine. And he's a cold killing machine. And the thing that should terrify us a little bit as we watch movies like this is that we find ourselves rooting for him. The bodies fall all around, and we're Christians, but we're rooting for the guy, even though he's committing murder, because we are more interested in Jason's spiritual quest to discover who he really is, so that we don't notice those things, or those murders become unimportant. This is really interesting. Our culture's authorities and spiritual quests have been altered. If we didn't resonate with Jason's quest to find out who he really is, we couldn't watch these movies without being horrified by what he does. And to the extent that we can enjoy a movie like this, we have become like him. The Christian spiritual quest, of course, is the reconciliation with God and with our neighbor. That's not what Jason is looking for, because he fundamentally does not believe that these things are possible. So the spiritual quest for identity formation becomes primary, not the love of God or neighbor. And this quest is the highest thing, and it is the thing that Jason will sacrifice for, even if he sacrifices other human beings. The other consequence is that what I bring out of me is sacred. Now, at the risk of digressing, I'm going to talk about another article that I read recently by Maria Carla Sanchez, and she was writing in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Just came out this month. She's an English literature professor, and she was writing about her students' lack of imagination as they read literature. She says that her students can't believe that authors can write about things that they haven't experienced. So if you write about a terrible home life, you must have experienced a terrible home life, and students can't believe that it could be otherwise, that people could have made it up. She says, quote, "Everything our authors write is what they really feel, a skillfully arranged and titled page straight from their diaries," close quote. What I bring out of me then, in our culture now, is me. And this is huge for our ministries. Now, have you ever heard someone in a Christian church say, hate the sinner, hate the sin, love the sinner? That's not happening in a culture that's made this huge switch to move the locus of authority inside. If you identify something that I bring out of me as sinful, that says that there is a problem with me, because I make no distinction between what I do, what I bring out, and who I am. You're saying that the problem is with me. It is not that for people in our culture now, it's not that there is a God who loves us in spite of our sin and was willing to die for us while we were yet sinners and hopes to transform us. They see this as a direct critique. This is also why Christian Smith, a sociologist who studies young adults, says that most young adults won't admit to having regret for their actions, because to admit to having regret is to say that I did something wrong, and that means that there's something wrong with me. This is why in our culture, when people bring something out from within, it is to be celebrated, because not to celebrate what you present to other people is not to celebrate you. And it is received as an attack on you. Part of the reason our culture is becoming less tolerant of religious viewpoints is because they do not see religion or anything else as a debate about ideas. This is a debate about identities and existence. And to tolerate other viewpoints is seen as an existential threat. I'm going to move on. That's imagination. I want to talk about the smartphone and technology here. I'm going to talk about this more in the presentation, but I just want to point out here that Jason Bourne navigates through the world with largely unaided, but he has the help of smartphones. I want you to think about how technology has worked in our culture. Let's think about older technology for a minute, like the television. The German word for television is Fernseher. Fernseher literally means the far seer. It's what lets you see far. And we often don't think about the impact of technology that stretches us. But if you think about, say, World War I, that's when you start to see the introduction of airplanes for military reconnaissance. And what they did is they would fly over the battlefield and they would see far. And the armies that could see far had a tactical advantage. And this is what made people have to introduce things like camouflage, because they needed suddenly to hide from the eyes in the sky. TVs let us see far off places, and those places become part of our world and they become part of our concern. And this changes the scale in which we live. The information, but the scale of information that was delivered by a television was delivered through the TV and curated by the television networks. And what I mean by that is that while we could see across the world with television, it was always a limited view. The smartphone, or tablets, as Steve Jobs said, lets you hold the internet in your hands. And what you hold in your hands is something that you can control. That's why how we use that language. Now, there's a conceit here about us being able to control the internet. And this is a breathtaking conceit. And Steve Jobs meant it to be. Right? There's no filter. There's this vast body of information that I control. And this changes how I think about myself. Now everything is in your hands, but the scale has changed again. The scale is now all the information of the internet. And you think that you're in the center of that. And you actually start to need the phone in order to manage that world. You are still limited in terms of time. And so the attention that you give to everything starts to change your world, because it means that there is less attention that you can give to those other things that you used to give attention to. We see this kind of thing happening in our local church ministries, where people simply don't have time to volunteer in the church, because there is a sense that if I know about what's going on in all the world, then I have a responsibility to that knowledge and what I'm going to do. So attention has become the currency of our culture. It is fragmented. We now have continuous partial attention, and it becomes incompatible with such basic Christian disciplines as prayer, devotion, and church attendance. Last thing I want to put up here before we sort of move on is social networks. And there is a paradox in our culture that we are connected, and yet we're lonely. We're connected like never before, and we're lonely like never before. And if you look at our character, Jason Bourne, he has the capacity to be connected to people, but he is fundamentally alone. So just to summarize what we sort of learn and see from Jason Bourne, that the past now has become bad, the future has become inaccessible, so we live in the moment. The locus of authority has moved from outside places to inside. I am what I bring out of myself, and I expect that to be celebrated, not critiqued, not put through a moral framework or lens. I manage my world through technology, particularly smartphones, and there is this just massive change of scale. not going to spend as much time on this television show Once Upon a Time, but I want to show you that it's not just Jason Bourne, and it's not just my favorite movies. Once Upon a Time is a television series that's been running since about 2012. What it does is it takes the whole stable of characters from Disney Studios and puts them all in one place. And in the opening episode of the series, you have all of these fairy tale characters existing in a fairy tale world, and the Wicked Witch from Snow White comes along and she puts a curse on them. Now, the curse is not that they're separated from God. The curse is that she wipes out all of their memories and sets them down in some stereotypical American town called Storybrooke, but they don't know who they really are. Do you see the spiritual quests here, the lack of memory, the lack of identity, the changes in time? There is a question of mobility here because they're uprooted from their place, and mobility is a theme that we're going to come back to. But with mobility, your world is dislocated when you have to move, whether you're an immigrant or you're an internal migrant in a country like Canada. Authority changes, what you tolerate changes, but your spiritual quest becomes a spiritual quest to get back to who you really are. And it is significant that in this story, everybody is a fairy tale character who we celebrate in all kinds of kids' stories. Just by way of recap, we're going to start to get into some stats here. We have a series of dislocations. We have dislocations in time, in space, and in relationships. And we're going to live in the present. We're going to reduce our space to what is around our person, and we're going to increasingly rely just on ourselves. So I'm making a shift here now. I'm going to look at religious service attendance because I want us to understand how our position in Canada has changed over time. And I want us to focus in on what people actually do when we talk about the strength of the church. Religious service attendance is a better measure of religious commitment than religious affiliation, because there's a real difference between what people say they believe and what they do. So first here, these red dots that I put on the screen, these represent Gallup polls going back to just after the Second World War. 1946, 67% of Canadians told George Gallup that they were in church on that Sunday. You can see that these other Gallup polls going on, that there's a fairly steady decline. If I add in election studies, these are done by scholars after different elections. You can see that fills in the pattern. The green ones here are Angus Reid and Ipsos Reid polls. These ask people about the frequency of their religious service attendance, and I've just graphed here those that say they go weekly or more. Here we can put in general social surveys done by the government, but you can see that there is a general pattern here and that there's a fairly straight line. I want you to know that down here right now, only about 13% of Canadians are attending religious services on a weekly basis, and that includes Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, everybody. Fairly big difference. Now, I want to add in these top diamonds at the top here. Reg Bibby, a sociologist in Canada, has been asking people about their belief in God over time. And I want you to see that there is this, if we draw a line here, there's quite a few more people that believe in God than attend religious services, which is a form of religious commitment that would suggest that they actually do believe in God. And this is why looking at what people actually do is often a better measure of religious commitment. Now, here's a decline in church attendance, and sometimes we can sort of beat up on ourselves and say, well, this is the decline in religion. But there is in our society a general decline in participation in different mediating structures. So this here is a chart that looks at Boy Scout membership in Canada from 1990 to 2015. And so you can see that in just a couple of decades, the Boy Scouts have been halved in terms of their participation. And you can see that some of these tipping points some of the low points where things started to change happened at the same time as churches. If we look at this slide here, this is Canadian kids' participation in sports. Here we just have two data points, 92 and 2005. But even in something that everybody agrees on, there's sort of not a moral a moral component so much that goes with sports, that there has been a general decline. What is common to all of these is that there is a commitment to the group. There is an idea of what formation looks like, and there is a locus of authority in participating in that group that is outside of yourselves. But we have a general reduction in civic participation in Canada. Coming back to our attendance data here, here's 3 or 4 polls, one in 96, 2003, 2013, and 2014. The blue here represents those that attend religious services at least weekly, the yellow, monthly or more, the gray, light gray, at least yearly, but less than monthly, and the dark gray, never. And we've got red up here, those that don't know or refused. If I sort of put a line here to sort of show some of the change here, what you see is that there's this big drop between 2003 and 2013. We see that kind of shift sometime in that time period in a lot of data, and I think that there's something really significant that's happened in the culture. Now, you can say that religious service attendance fell in half, but the more significant thing here is the group of people here that never attend religious services. In fact, when we did our 2013 survey, each of these are pretty robust national polls done with reputable polling companies, 3,000 people. We actually wondered whether we got a bad poll because there was such a difference in a short amount of time. Angus Reid repeated the poll for us, and the results came out the same. If we look at the same data here, but now by different generations, you can see that this is a pattern that isn't just so much about young people anymore. You can see that while the silent generation, which were born before the end of the Second World War, are a little bit more likely to attend religious services, that once you get to the boomers, Gen X or Gen Y, you're getting some very similar patterns. Religious affiliation, I said that this isn't as good a measure of religious affiliation, but or of religious commitment, but it helps us, it gives us another way to kind of understand some of the changes in Canada. There are two sides to this chart. On the left, we have Angus Reid data. This is Angus Reid / Ipsos Reid data. On this side, we have census and national household survey data. So the light blue and the dark blue here, these represent Roman Catholics. The light blue is French Roman Catholics. The dark blue is English-speaking Roman Catholics. The red is mainline Protestants, green evangelicals, the yellow other Christians. Then we have other religions in light gray, and then those with no religion. And this includes atheists, agnostics, spiritual. But I want you to see is that there's this large growth from 96 down to 2013, that now that 40% of people tell pollsters, and this is a larger amount than what we're going to see with the census, but tell pollsters that they have no religious affiliation at all. So they're pulling out of the group, back to themselves, often finding, again, that locus of authority in themselves. On the census, we see some of the same patterns. Not quite as likely to tell the government that they have no religious affiliation. Some of this is sort of cultural associations with church that come out, but still the same kinds of patterns. Different study that we did in 2011, it was the hemorrhaging faith study that some of you may be aware of, where we looked at how young people stay in the church. We asked them what their religious affiliation was as a child growing up, and then we asked them again for their religious affiliation as a young adult. And here's what we found, that if we looked at Catholics in Quebec, only about half of them are still saying that they're Catholic. Again, the blue here represents Catholic. As a young adult, similar kinds of findings in the rest of Canada. That's what ROC stands for. Mainline Protestants, only about a third of them are still saying that they have a mainline affiliation of their childhood. Evangelicals, about 2/3. Where people are moving, the vast majority are moving into the atheist, agnostic, and spiritual, and none and spiritual. So what they're doing is they're moving out of organized religion at all. And what this has in common, again, is an organized religion has an authority that's external to yourself. It has a vision of what spiritual growth or development looks like that is guided by something outside of yourself. So I want to introduce the Christian Evangelical Scale to you. The Christian Evangelical Scale is a way of pollsters finding evangelicals. It's based on David Bebbington's quadrilateral, where he says there are four things that evangelicals tend to emphasize. One is biblicism, one is activism, one is conversionism, one is crucicentrism, and I'll explain these. Biblicism is the belief that the Bible has an authority in your life. Again, we talked about these external authorities being a problem in our culture. Activism, this includes social justice and evangelism. Conversionism is the belief that everyone must make a decision for Christ for themselves. And then crucicentrism, this is the centrality of the preaching of the cross. So Andrew Grenville, who's now with Maru Matchbox, but was with Angus Reid at the time that he developed this, developed an 8-point scale that measured these things. Here's the short form versions of the questions: whether God is a superstition or not, whether Jesus was raised from the dead, whether there's forgiveness through Jesus, is Jesus God or not, is the Bible reliable and trustworthy, is evangelism important, do you consider yourself a converted Christian, and what your frequency of attendance at church is. Now, obviously, some of these questions are scored positively and negatively. Basically, the higher your number, the more likely you are to be what we call evangelically aligned. Why do we say that language? Andrew Grenville would have said that you were an evangelical. However, we found that there would be Roman Catholics, mainline Protestants, who wouldn't want to consider themselves necessarily evangelical, who nevertheless were evangelically aligned. By that, we mean they believe and behave like evangelicals. So here's how the scale works. Because you get at least 1 point for every question, your lowest score is 8, your highest score is 32. We said that if you score between 28 and over, that you're evangelically aligned, okay? We broke this further into moderately aligned and strongly aligned. So 28 to 30 is moderately aligned. 31 and 32 are strongly aligned, okay? Then these aren't even ranges here. The moderately unaligned is typically where you would find most, historically, most mainline Protestants and Catholics. And then the strongly unaligned are those that are hostile to evangelicals. If we map this, and here's what we're doing. We've got 4 polls here. We've got the strongly aligned here in blue, and I'm a dark blue. You can see that. Here's the moderately aligned, moderately unaligned, strongly unaligned. And so I want to look at something here. This 2003 poll was done in the lead up to the same-sex marriage debate, September 2003. There's a bit of a rally in Christian sentiment in Canada in the lead up. After that, things fall off. We also have this massive change for various reasons here, where there's a big fall off in those that are strongly aligned. Big finding here, though, is that up here, the strongly unaligned grows like crazy. You can see here, if we look at comparing 1996 to 2013, we're looking at the same kinds of numbers here, but now we're looking at it over age. You can see that in 96, the greatest generation, which are older and don't appear in 2013, more likely to be strongly aligned, silent generation as well, and then it declines. So you see similar kind of decline, but it's much shallower. So the culture is becoming more homogenous in terms of where you find your evangelically aligned Canadians. The big deal here is this huge growth in those that are strongly unaligned. And while we have a similar core of Generation Y evangelicals that are evangelically aligned, most of their cohort is strongly unaligned, actually quite hostile to the faith. If I were to graph this, and I'm not going to belabor this too much longer, but I'm going to show you 3 slides. And this is a distribution. We have 3 polls, 3,000 people. This is the distribution of the answers and the scores that people gave to the evangelical scale. The green, again, are evangelicals. Evangelical affiliates are red, mainline. blue Catholic. This is how things looked in 96. Again, the higher the score, the more evangelically aligned. This line here is the cutoff. Here's 96, here's 2003. I'm just going to go back and forth for a minute. 96, 2003. You can see that swell of support as it shifts down here. And then things fall in 2013. All in 2013. So you can see that there's been this enormous and quick shift away from the culture. Let's start. So that is going to be important for us in terms of people understanding us, in terms of people tolerating us, because I want you to appreciate just how strange this makes us in a culture. I want to talk about smartphones, and I want to talk about smartphones because smartphones actually are what we do. And we're going to look at some slides in a minute that show how much time people are starting with smartphones. But I want you to consider how quickly that they influence our culture. I just got told that I've got 15 minutes, and I'm going to do my best to get through this in the next 15 minutes. In our culture, this graph shows the implementation of different technologies like electricity, telephone, radio, and television, and it shows how many years it took for 1/4 of the US population to adopt that technology. Now, the red bars are US population. We have some Canadian data here in the green bars. But what I want you to see is that the adoption rate of new technologies has gone down. We have the mobile phone here in 83 took about 14 years for a 1/4 of Canadians to get it. 7 years for the introduction of the internet. Smartphone in 2007, it took 4 years. Now, I'm picking 2007 because that's when the iPhone was introduced. We can argue about whether the BlackBerry was a smartphone or not. Look at wireless mobile subscribers in Canada. This is data provided by the industry organization. Here's what the CRTC says the rate of smartphone adoption is. So if we see that in 2014, if this is all of the smartphones subscribers, the yellow here represents the percentage of those that were smartphones. Now, I'm going to add in another line here. This red line is the growth in the Canadian population. You can see that most of the adult population has a phone now, and most of those are now smartphones. Let's think about some of the things that made up these smartphones. Here in 1985, when we start to get wireless subscribers, we've got Microsoft Windows, that's the first one, Linux, Netscape, RIM 850. Here's a picture of that device just in case you forgot what it looks like. Yes, that was the first one. We got an iPod. And now some of these things, once we get into the yellow here, start taking over parts of our world here. And I want you to think about how this changes. YouVersion, this is the Bible app that many of you see on your phone. This comes in 2008, just as smartphones are picking up in usage. Prior to this, prior to a Bible app being on your phone, if you were in a church service, the pastor would have asked you to turn your phone off. Now it's encouraged, and it becomes part of your church service, takes over again some of the attention in your church services. We've got Uber, the taxi service, Instagram, Duolingo takes over a piece of education, Tinder takes over a piece of dating, Apple Pay, commerce, Periscope is on-the-go broadcasting. Pokemon Go overlays virtual reality. We have an augmented reality. My point here is that this is gobbling up lots of parts of our lives. If we look at this survey here done by industry, shows the percentage of at-home users who use smartphones as their primary device. Again, here we're comparing those in blue who are age 18 to 24 and those that are 18 plus. We've got things like reading mail, checking the weather, getting directions, using Facebook, finding a restaurant, and watching a 60-second video. I want us to stop for a minute. I want us to think about, before this, how doing these tasks would have been different. If you were reading the mail, you would have had to go to a mailbox. You would have had to wait for the mailman to bring that. If you were checking the weather, you might wait for the news to come on or the newspaper to arrive. If you're getting directions, you might get out a a paper map. Remember paper maps? We don't realize how much of the world has been pulled into this one place that, again, supports the idea that I can be self-sufficient, and how much that is changing how people experience the world. And I want to impress upon you, even again, back with this last slide, how quickly this has happened. We stress out, if I go back here, and we wrote lots of things about television and how it changed our culture. It took 26 years for a quarter of the culture to get a television. It took 4 years for a quarter of the culture to get a smartphone. 26 versus 4. And there's been very little reflection on how this changed us. I argue, and I'm arguing here, that the television changed our culture far less than the smartphone has, which is why I'm spending some time on this. If we look at the number of hours per week that is used with smartphones, there's different ones here. This is one that's in the US. It's got 25 to 32 hours for some young people. Vision Critical did a study in Canada, 14 hours to 15 hours. And then there was one done in the UK that found, 40 hours. Whatever it is, and the methodologies change. The point here being that there is large amounts of time being spent on these devices, and we have to start understanding this if we're going to understand our culture. Mobility. Again, mobility is something that people do. If they move, it is a huge life-disrupting event. StatCan checks mobility every 5 years, and what they do is they ask you whether you moved, and this is the number of Canadians. These are numbers by age along the bottom here. If you're in blue, you're a non-mover. If you're in yellow, you're a non-migrant mover, which means you moved in the same town. And if you're in red, you're a migrant. What I want you to see, especially among young people, this is where we're losing a lot of people. A huge percentage of young people are moving every 5 years. And this dislocation that we talked about, when you're dislocated in a move, you're out of your church, you're out of your family, and you have to learn to some extent, rely on yourself, especially if this is being done serially. Part of being part of church communities is having the time to form those relationships, and part of what we depend upon is the time that people get to form those relationships and then to get out and serve. If you're a migrant, let's say, think about immigrants for a minute, and we're going to look at some immigration stats in a minute. Immigrants in the first generation spend a great deal of their time getting settled in the new country to make things better for the next generation. But that's time that they don't necessarily participate in the wider civil society groups that would influence things like government or other things in their community. Not going to talk about this too much. I want you to appreciate here that in Canada, most of our population represented in the blue here is an urban population. The rural population really hasn't grown very much, even since the 1940s. Mass migration into the cities, and most new immigrants move into the cities. Let's talk about immigration. If we look at immigration, immigrants are more religiously devout and than people who are born in Canada. And this chart here, the pie chart, shows you the population of mainline Protestants in Canada and then their period of immigration. So in the dark blue here, these are the people that migrated in before 1971, and as we move around the pie, these are the more recent ones. I want you to see that the immigrants are also tend to be younger. That's partially because of immigration policy, and this represents, in the bar on the side, their age difference. I'm going to show you, this is mainline Protestants. Here's the same chart for Roman Catholics. Again, Roman Catholics a little bit younger, greater percentage of them are immigrants. Here's holiness. Not a lot of difference. The holiness denominations, this is a tradition within evangelicalism. Here's Baptists, a little bit more. And here's Pentecostal. And Pentecostals as a tradition have the most immigrants as an evangelical tradition. So want to show you what difference this makes. This chart here represents the annual number of attendance days at religious services by ethnicity. So there's 52 Sundays in a year. People who have an African ethnicity on average are attending 27 times in a year. Those from the Caribbean, 23. If we go down to the other end, we've got those from the British Isles, 14. Those that are Jewish, 11. Aboriginal, 10. French, 10. Right. The difference is that a lot of these ones are the ones that tend to have been born in Canada. Another study here showing by place of birth shows that here people who are born in Canada tend to attend religious services 10 times a year versus those from Africa, 33. Again, different study, same kind of result. What seems to be going on here? People from outside of Canada that are born outside of Canada, they have a different culture, the different set of cultural assumptions, and a different set of connections to people in their communities and a different way of being. They are, if we could say, less like Jason Bourne than we are. Now, when I say that I am talking about people who are born here in Canada. We are more like Jason Bourne in that we are self-reliant. We tend to place authority within ourselves. We are dislocated, if not by immigration, by the necessity to move for work. And these are all the kinds of things that we have to grapple with very directly if we're to pass on the faith to the next generation. Just by comparison here, and we're almost done. I want to show you the Muslim communities. These are the same kinds of immigration slides, and you can see that most of the Muslims who are in Canada now are immigrants. Same for Hindus, same for Sikhs. And there's the change in religious affiliation. You know, it's an open question if Canada's immigration remains high. Ultimately, which sort of cultural paradigm, whether it's sort of the Jason Bourne one that I've outlined or one that is more rooted in strong communities, religious, cultural, or otherwise. But there is a tension, and the tension has even crept into our churches. And, you know, what I often say to people is that, you know, when we have other gods, whether the gods be the ones that we've sort of made for ourselves inside of ourselves, you know, a god is a locus of authority, right? It's what you submit to. When Paul went into the Areopagus, he didn't try to accommodate those gods. He sort of directly challenged some of the thinking that underlined some of their assumptions. And we have to start, I think, being very aware of what those assumptions are and think about what people do. We have to think about things like mobility, things like smartphone use, things like all of those things, and how they support and make the ideas that supports kind of a Jason Bourne worldview very plausible. Jason Bourne's worldview, to be plausible, you have to constantly be undermining people's confidence in external authority. You need people that are mobile so that they never stay rooted and form very strong relationships, which would be a counterbalance to that very strong individualism. And you need people that are very self-reliant. And all of those things make the Jason Bourne worldview plausible, not inevitable, but plausible. And we need to start talking about those influences on people. So that's the end of my presentation. You can see on the screen that there's some ways that you can contact me. If I don't see any questions, but if you want to continue the conversation afterwards, I would be happy to talk with you. I want to thank you for your time. This webinar will be posted on our website afterwards, and you can go back and view it. Or if you contact me at the email address there below, I'd be happy to send you this PowerPoint. Thanks.